in 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Loa Boots. Start your day off on the right foot with footwear that was designed for those who stand relentlessly in the face of adversity. I wear Loa every single day, for miles on canine searches and for hours on tactical operations in inclement weather. No matter what, Loa keeps me moving. Whether you run, hike, hunt, or fight, on the streets or out in the woods, Loa has the gear you need to help you conquer whatever challenges you face. Go check out their new line of trail running shoes at Loa Boots, L-O-W-A Boots.com, and get outside for some fresh air and daylight. Loa, for those who know where they're going and won't stop until they get there.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by ManusX. We've talked a lot about the tactical fantasy on this podcast, and one of the quickest ways to break your tactical fantasies and actually improve your performance is by getting real feedback. One of the ways you can do that is with ManusX. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, data, and coaching. And you need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that tracks you while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a drill and coaches you as you go. It is indispensable to taking your shooting to the next level. Go find them on manusx.com.
So, Jim, I just got back from SHOT Show. And
SHOT Show, that's where they sell all the guns, right?
Yeah, if you want to get yourself in some trouble. It's
the world's biggest gun show, and they don't sell any guns there. It's very upsetting, very disappointing. Yeah.
And I love SHOT, and we love SHOT. SHOT's great. It's a good time, and usually there's a lot of really good people that I get to see and interact with and hang out with. But I think it's only fair to also point out that it's such a great opportunity to people watch.
And there's a lot of people. There's like 17,000 people on 4 floors of a giant convention center, all buying, selling, waddling, walking, coughing, touching each other, touching you, shaking hands, looking at your little badge.
Yeah.
Fingering guns.
It's a lot of people.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
A lot of people, a lot of guns, and you get to see every little subset of the gun culture archetype in every form, and it's kind of entertaining.
Yeah, it's not just $1 billion industry. It is most certainly a lifestyle. And man, some people are all up in that lifestyle and all the little sub lifestyles. You get to see all the little camps and tribes and stuff. It's kind of fun. It's like Mean Girls.
Yeah. And with that, it's also a good showcase of all the egos at play in our little subculture here in the gun world. And to be clear, I obviously fit into one or more of those myself. I'm not blind to that. And Jim and I don't claim any sort of immunity from falling into the ego trap ourselves.
No. I'm a pilot, which means I am way better at handling ego than you, and maybe the best at it. Possibly the best that's ever been. Yeah. Right? Yeah.
Obviously. But all those egos at play. Yeah. So it's a big part of leadership and emotional intelligence to have a little bit of self-awareness, right? So I thought it would be a good discussion to try to understand egos a little bit better and how to navigate and deal with those a little bit. For one thing, I actually think that doing so will make us more effective in terms of thought leadership and professional development and just doing our jobs, right? Like just understanding egos and how to navigate them is important. But there's also some really significant survival lessons at play here in terms of de-escalating conflict and being able to disarm the effects of a big ego in a parking lot of a Walmart, for example. So I think there's several angles we can take on this. So the big theme for tonight's talk is check your ego. Now, for anyone who is crazy enough to not, and I'm not throwing hate, if you haven't seen Ted Lasso, you need to go check it out. It's one of the best shows of our time, I think, right now.
Great show about leadership, great show about coaching, great show about winning and what that means. There's a lot of really goodness there.
Yeah.
Also, if you like Ted Lasso, I want you to also watch Shoresy, which is a spin-off of Letterkenny, Canadian show, and it's a hockey show. And it's like Ted Lasso, just a little bit sassier. And I want you to watch that too.
I'm going to have to check that out myself. But essentially, they bring a football coach from the States, from I think like Kansas. And
the Midwest.
Everything you'd think about a football coach from Kansas, to England to coach soccer. And he's obviously a bit of a misfit, but there's a lot of leadership lessons wrapped up in the show. And this particular scene, I'm just going to play a 1 or 2 minute clip of as a primer for this discussion about egos and one way that he kept this guy's ego in check. He challenged him to a dart game. And there was a bet at play, and Ted Lasso kind of settles the bet a little bit and kind of checks this guy's ego. And I think it's a good example of this in case you haven't heard it.
Hey! Better manners when I'm holding a dart. Please. May, what do I need to win?
2 triple 20s and a bullseye.
Good luck. You know, Rupert, guys have underestimated me my entire life. And for years, I never understood why. It used to really bother me. But then one day, I was driving my little boy to school, and I saw this quote by Walt Whitman. It was painted on the wall there. It said, "Be curious, not judgmental." I like that. So I get back in my car, and I'm driving to work. And all of a sudden, it hits me. All them fellas that used to belittle me, not a single one of them were curious. You know, they thought they had everything all figured out, and so they judged everything, and they judged everyone. And I realized that they're underestimating me. Who I was had nothing to do with it. Because if they were curious, they would ask questions. You know? Questions like, have you played a lot of darts, Ted? Which I would have answered, yes, sir. Every Sunday afternoon at a sports bar with my father from age 10 until I was 16 when he passed away. Barbecue sauce.
Come on, let's go.
You are a very lovely consolation prize.
Rebecca, Ted, enjoy your evening. May, as always.
Holy shit, that felt good.
That was fun, yeah.
Barbecue sauce. So, Ted Lasso is a great show. Leave it at that. To defeat and deal with egos in general, we need to understand them a little bit. And if we're going to try to navigate it, we have to have a sense of where it comes from, right? It didn't come from nowhere. And there's actually a lot of reasons our ego has served us in a lot of ways.
For sure. Words mean things. I'm not going to read the dictionary definition of ego to you, but it's important to understand that it means different things to different people and in different contexts, right? The way Mike and I mean ego colloquially is colloquially.
That's a word, right?
That's a word. Colloquially.
It's an important word, but it's a word.
All right. The way we
really
mean
well
it
in writing, not so much
when we're just the way we mean it when we're just talking back and forth is, we mean it in the informal sense, right? Self-importance or an inflated sense of self-importance, arrogance, narcissism, that kind of thing, right? But to understand it, we got to understand all the other meanings, right? And the big part of this is the psych background. I'm not a psychologist, neither is my buddy Mike, but I've taken a class or two. For anyone not tracking, there was this dude named Freud back in the day. He didn't invent psychology, but he got a lot of people thinking and talking about psychology, about studying how we think and how our beliefs and our behaviors form, right? Not all of his ideas stood up to modern day science and understanding. Most of them have been trashed by modern day science, but that's fine. He got people talking, right? And he laid the groundwork for a lot of how we understand ourselves, how we talk about psychology. Kind of a lot of that started with this Freud guy. And a big part of that is recognizing that some of your mental workings are conscious. You think about them, right? They're conscious to you. Some are working kind of under the surface. And some are under the surface until they pop up. And then you're thinking about them. The analogy attributed to him, and I don't know enough about his writings to know whether he actually said it, is the iceberg, right? You picture there's the part you see, and then there's all the whole rest of it that you don't see.
Under the surface.
Under the surface. And neat little words mean things. Recently in warfare, we've been talking a lot about liminal warfare. Liminal is like right at the edge of where you can tell something's going on. Subliminal, below the edge of where you can tell something's going on. Conscious is where you know it's going on. You're talking about it, right?
Obvious, clear, yeah.
Obvious, clear, right? Overt. So id, ego, and superego were words he used in his language to explain kind of what's going on, what you're thinking about, how you got there. And in his language, your id, spelled ID, id, is your like instinctive drives. Think basic animal instincts, all the good ones. The stuff you were hardwired to do. Fighting, fucking fleeing, all that stuff, right? That's him.
Your wants. That was a big part of it, was the things that you want.
And the things you don't even think about that you want, right? Your ego is your conscious effort to keep that id in check.
And I want to get laid, but I can't just go...
go grab everyone I see, right? It's frowned upon in modern society. And then you have superego, which is all the stuff you've been taught by your culture, your parents, and school. Some of that drives you consciously, and some of it drives you subconsciously. Funny thing about that, this sounds actually really familiar. It sounds a lot like the stuff that makes up the orientation segment of your OODA loop. In fact, some of the diagrams of id, ego, and superego actually look a lot like an OODA loop diagram. You'll hear other analogies, like the conscious part of your brain, sort of like the rider on a horse or the rider on an elephant. I actually recently heard John Correa talk about that on his YouTube channel on active self-protection. Like, the idea behind that is the rider has some say and some pull, but sometimes that horse goes where it goes.
The animal be the animal.
Yeah. So when we talk about ego, this plays a role, right? But that's not really what we're talking about. Usually we're talking about kind of an inflated sense of self-importance or narcissism or inflated sense of confidence. And that's really what we want to get through here on this podcast.
Colloquially.
Yeah.
Yes.
La 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 la.
So one of the places, if you dive into some of that psychology stuff that Jim was talking about when it comes to our wants and our needs and our instincts, and I'm gonna pick at this in chunks, right? But one of those places is as a defense mechanism. Our ego, if you think about the basic survival function of our brain, one of those primitive animalistic behaviors that we see in nature is the way that some creatures will posture to try to scare off threats. For example, you'll see dogs that raise their hackles and show their teeth. And there's those one dinosaurs that my kid really likes to have the big, circle flare out piece of skin flap thing that looks really big and badass when it gets all pissed off. You know what I'm talking about? Totally.
It was in Jurassic Park. Yeah.
And although those things don't necessarily demonstrate how capable those animals would be in combat, in fact, some could argue a degree of insecurity, they serve a purpose to posture and to try to scare or ward off threats in some way, right? If you were to dig into a little bit further down that like psychology rabbit hole, we could talk about Maslow's hierarchy. And we've talked about that on the show. In fact, we did an entire episode about Maslow's hierarchy that you could go find. But in essence, this taps into the hierarchy of needs in humans and what people are motivated by to ultimately find their purpose and meaning in life and fulfill their potential. One of the things that Maslow identified in his hierarchy of needs, and maybe more importantly, distinguished between, is self-esteem and esteem from others. That humans essentially need esteem, and that you can satisfy that in a couple of ways. One is that recognition from others, and one is that sense of self-worth and self-esteem that you have within, right? And part of his theory assumes a level of security, right? That those lower level survival needs like food and shelter and safety, and then up to social needs like a sense of belonging and love and a support structure, right? All of those things build into this hierarchy that lead to esteem and self-esteem. And what it teaches us is that some people will short circuit their way into fulfilling those needs. Nature hates a vacuum, right? We've said that a lot of times on this show. And if you are lacking in, say, family or social support, you might find that elsewhere. And for some people, they will find that in places like clubs or sports teams. And for some people, they might find it in places like gangs or cults. So there are healthy and unhealthy ways of fulfilling those needs. And in the absence of a strong foundation, we will tend to compensate or take shortcuts. Sometimes, for the sake of our ego, that might mean at the expense of others. If we are looking for recognition or validation from other people, we might do that at the expense of humiliating somebody else, just as an example, right? So that sense of ego, like our self-esteem, our sense of worth, is often too dependent on other people to meet those needs.
Yeah, when it comes to insecurity and compensation, one of the things that kind of hits me is this has come up a couple times in work. Some of my dealings over the years, I tend to come on strong, right? I believe in what I'm doing. I believe in the case I'm making, and I am very blunt about what I'm trying to get done. I'm passionate about it, right? I believe in what I do. What we do has consequence. I want us to get it right, right? And I expect everyone else is too. But then some guy will come along and will come way over the top at me. And I kind of have to step back. And usually it becomes pretty clear over the course of working with this human that the other party is actually just really nervous about dealing with me. And they're way overdoing it because they think they have to, because they think that's how they would get respect from me, or they're afraid I'm going to embarrass them in front of their friends. And so I have to kind of check myself in that conversation and back off and be like, okay, this guy's got a sensitive ego. Cool. I'm going to tone it down and let's see if we can reframe this conversation a little bit, right?
And that's one of the challenges, is recognizing which of those roles you might play.
Do I need to play him up or do I need to play him down?
Or are you trying to play yourself up or down?
Yeah.
Right.
And I'd like to think I don't have any ego in this. Of course I do. Right.
Right. That's the thing, right? One of the social challenges that we face here is that we tend to thrive by comparison. Right. And why is that? I don't know. That's kind of a rhetorical question. But if you think in the grand scheme of things, at the end of the day, we're just a speck on the radar of life. Like, we don't really mean anything. Right? Any one person isn't anything. There are very few people in time and history and space that actually made the difference by themselves.
All we are is dust in the wind. There's a whole song about it.
Yeah. But like oftentimes there's a very iterative process, right? Like when things evolve and change and big things happen and when history is made, there are steps along the way. And there might be a turning point where you can point to one thing or one person and be like, that's actually, but for the most part, it was just one step in a bigger process, right? But it's kind of silly at the end of the day that we all seem to compare ourselves, right? If you think about, like, take yourself out of this for a second and think about two similar, like-minded people who you know and know them well and compare them. And there are probably a lot of similarities, a lot of differences, and there isn't really an objective way of keeping some sort of tally or score of those things. People are just different, and there's trade-offs, and that's okay. Some people are better at other things, and that's fine, right? And yet, we find ourselves often stuck comparing ourselves to others in this, like, keeping up with the Joneses sort of way, far too often, right? And one of the reasons I think that we might do this is that, like, we're trying to manage this, like, scoreboard in a sense, right? Whenever we're ahead or we're doing well, that comparison shields us from vulnerability. It pushes us up in the hierarchy. We're like, I'm not doing as bad as so-and-so, or I'm doing worse than so-and-so, so I have to check up. I have to, like, move myself forward in some way. And one of the places that this takes me as it relates to some of the psych stuff is just cognitive biases. Since at the end of the day, we're really just animals, it's also important to note that we're also kind of dumb. And I think we have to watch out for that because especially as it relates to our own ego, it's fair to acknowledge that when we look at the world, right, we are the main character in our own story. So of course, our interest is going to be favorable to ourselves.
And that's okay, right? You don't have to be embarrassed or ashamed by that,
Sure.
right? You can be a humble servant leader and still understand that you are the main character of your story. In fact, some of the people I know who talk the most about being humble servant leaders, also the most center characters in their stories.
Well,
I don't know if that made sense, but I've seen
to Jim's point about that being okay, like from a sense of self-worth, it's important to see yourself as the main character in your story.
Yeah.
Because that's the one thing that you can control in a world full of things that you can't, right? But the truth is, most people don't really care about us or our stories that much. So it's important that we keep that in context when we're interacting with other people, right?
I love that. That's huge.
So related to all the psych stuff that goes into our ego, there's also some biology factors in this. There are some very real chemical responses that happen in our physiology, right? Our brains are wired in such a way to avoid pain or injury and to seek rewards. That is a fact of life, right? That's unavoidable.
There's a great book about this. It's called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins.
Ooh, that's good.
I recommend it. It's solid. And what it says is you only exist for your genes.
Yeah.
Your genes want what's best for your genes.
Yeah,
they don't want what's best for you. They want what's best for your genes.
I mean, yeah, let's face it. Like evolution has taught us to want to fuck for a reason, right? It is necessary to the survival of the human species.
That's actually on Mike's eHarmony page.
Obviously.
He just turned bright red.
But it is legitimately relevant to survival, right? And part of this is all rooted in our limbic system. And that is the system that regulates our sympathetic nervous response, the fight or flight response, right? It's heavily influenced by perceived threats. And it's important to recognize that they are perceived threats, not necessarily actual threats, because you can be caught completely off guard and murdered by surprise long before your sympathetic nervous response might catch up to it, right? It's too late. Or you can perceive a threat when there really isn't one. People who are afraid of heights despite being very securely strapped in. People who are afraid of flying, even though it is very statistically proven that it's much safer than most forms of travel. People who are afraid of public speaking because they don't want to embarrass themselves in front of a group of people. There are social and professional situations that can prompt a level of anxiety that comes from that subconscious and irrational place.
And Mike has talked about this before, and I think it's a really, really important point, that in a debrief, when someone calls you out in the middle of a debrief, it is physiologically the same experience as someone threatening you with a gun.
A little bit of anxiety,
right?
Yeah.
It triggers your survival. Oh my God, I'm under attack, right? And think about your conscious self and your subconscious self. You need to use your little brain to say, I'm not actually under attack. This person's trying to help me. That's what makes you coachable. That's kind of the key of this whole episode is use your conscious brain to say, hey, I don't need to win this battle. This is not a tiger. Yeah. This is my instructor trying to help me, right?
Yeah, or your mentors or your role models or the senior people on your team, and that legitimately like, hey, I fucked up. Like, that's okay. I just made a mistake. Like, it's not the end of the world. And they're only telling me because they care, right? So in the sense of like our brains are wired to avoid pain and injury and seek rewards, we get dopamine from the good feelings. Similarly to that debrief that Jim is talking about, if someone says, hey, I thought you did a really good job, or that was a good call, or whatever, right? We get that like rush of dopamine, and that's an addictive, like,
it's a hell of a drug.
It's a hell of a drug. And they've linked that to everything: infidelity in relationships, gambling, substance abuse, anything you can think of that brings pleasure to the brain boils down to dopamine, right? So related to avoiding all the traps of the ego, right? Our brain can irrationally respond to threats in a sense, but we also overlook how well certain experiences can become a learned or rewarded experience, right? Something that has worked well for us in the past and then works well again a second time has now been reinforced. And sometimes the reward or the reinforcement comes from avoiding certain things. So if you think about how a lot of dudes, right, in our industries, these male dominant, like we talk about masculinity, which is a whole area that I intentionally left out of this episode, but I thought about, right? But a lot of dudes are afraid of talking about their feelings or admitting that they were scared about certain things because society has taught us that those weren't manly things to do. And so we have avoided them for so long that we have trouble letting our guard down. That's a learned behavior. And it's something that we probably learned when we were really, really young.
So to bring this back to SHOT Show, Mike and I were talking about this the other day about how depending on what your strengths in the industry are, that's the only thing you tend to want to talk about, right? So our competition shooter friends, they want to talk about how fast and accurate they shoot.
And how much better they are than cops or military guys or whatever.
The military backgrounded guys only want to talk about their combat experiences because that's what establishes them in the hierarchy.
It's
the
practical,
cop guys,
it's real life, it's not a game.
Yeah, the cop guys want to talk about they're on a two-way shooting range, like, right? Cop guys want to talk about how many years they were on the out on the beat, right? And they only want to talk about the thing that establishes their bona fides, their place in the hierarchy. And the funny thing about credibility, I want to know that you know what you're not good at. So, hi, I'm Jim. I'm a military guy. I'm not some soft ninja operator. I don't somersault through windows. I'm an air guy. I've done a lot of air stuff, weird air stuff. I shoot as often as I can. I'm not a ranked USPSA shooter. I probably never will be, and that's okay. I think I've got some things to teach, but I don't think that I'm the stud shooter expert, right? And that's okay. I can say that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point because one of the books that I read early on that talked about some high-level Army guys in the military that were doing a new thing, counterterrorism stuff. They discussed how they went to the competitive shooting world to learn how to shoot better. Because they recognized that, like, hey, like, there's a lot more to our job than shooting. And I think about my life as a SWAT guy or as a cop in general. And shooting is an important skill, just as a fundamental job proficiency task. Yeah, I should know how to shoot well for the things that I do. But it is not the only task. It's, in fact, a very small percentage of the things that I do on a day-to-day basis, like almost zero, really. It's not zero in terms of things I might have to do, but in terms of things that I regularly actually do, it's very small. And so these high-level Army guys went to the competitive shooting world and learned how to shoot better. And they tied a lot of that in. And I think it's interesting when you hear people talk about, yeah, but that's just a game. That's just competition. Well, that's weird. Because if you really dig into that a little bit, you might learn some things about how that might apply. So anyway, it's a tangent, but consider that knowing your own limitations in the sense that Jim is talking about goes a long way.
And embrace them, as in recognize the things you're not super strong at and acknowledge it. And honestly, to me, that builds your credibility. An instructor who won't admit any faults or flaws is a weak instructor.
One of the coolest experiences I ever had was I got to work with some really high level special ops dudes at one time in my career. And we were using some less lethal that they were like super intrigued about. And we found ourselves shooting this thing at parking signs in a parking lot, like handicap, because they were so like, oh my gosh, this is awesome, right? The mission had changed for them. Like the capture kill thing became a lot more capture, a lot less kill oriented in some senses, right? And so they
waxes and wanes.
Huh?
It comes and goes. And
yeah. But they became very interested in the less lethal stuff that we were doing, right? And their curiosity and open-mindedness, I thought, was refreshing, right? Not what I expected, especially considering what I had learned from them over the past several days prior to that. So, about past experiences, speaking of, our past experiences are full of these sorts of things, right? We have had these things modeled for us from a very young age, right? And not just from our environments, but also just from our parents, our coaches, our mentors. And because of that, we are likely to perpetuate or repeat those patterns, right? Sometimes that's really, really good. There are lots of cycles in that realm that we can perpetuate or repeat that are helpful, and sometimes not so much. One of the favorite points about this that someone made for me that's job relevant, professionally relevant, in an interview that we did on this show was Dr. Dan Bloomberg. We did an episode about law enforcement stuff, and he pointed out how people show up to the police academy where dudes in like campaign hats yell at us like drill instructors and expect police recruits to follow orders promptly and precisely. And then we're confused when new police officers go out and do just that in the community, and it doesn't work out so well. Think about that. We take these groups of individuals from the community that we want to make police officers, and the model that we use is this very militaristic salutes and stand at attention and barking orders. And that's not how we want them to behave in real life. But that's what we model for them. And we're surprised when they don't know any different out in the real world. Huh. Consider that. I think that's a really important point. So with that, there is also a lot of environmental and social factors at play that build into our ego. And we're going to talk about some culture stuff as it relates to our professions, the gun industry, military, law enforcement, that sort of thing in a little bit. But just recognizing in general that socially we tend to compare ourselves, right? That comparison thing, keeping up with the Joneses. We always want to rank ourselves in some hierarchy with our peers. That's always been a factor. That's always been true. And it probably always will be, is the other thing, right? Like, we can't just make that go away. But with that, we also have to recognize that, like, people's values and just philosophical differences that we all have are a factor. Some people grow up in neighborhoods or cultures or social settings where things like respect go a long way. We've talked about that on the show. Or things like shame, bringing shame to your family might motivate you a different way. So those philosophical differences and the individual values, right? Like, some people are really, really big on respect. And some people, I see my own self-worth. Like, I'm not really looking for that from other people, so it's not that big of a deal. But you can see the butting of the heads that comes with that.
And it's important that there are some kind of universal signs of respect, but sometimes there are very distinct ways people need to see it, or it doesn't count, right? There are certain signs of respect that matter in Japanese culture that you wouldn't see in most of American culture, or in a really rough neighborhood in Southern Arizona might have its whole rule set, right, for how you show respect. And if you don't know it, trying to fake it is going to make your life harder, right? But people can generally read, hey, this person's trying to show respect. Like, that by itself, that effort goes a long way. I would also offer, with signs of respect, there's also ways we show affection for each other, the 5 love languages, and there's the 5 languages of apology. Like, some people need to hear the words, I'm sorry, or it doesn't count. Or they need, hey, I messed up, my bad, I'm sorry, or I'll never do it again. And just recognize, like, you got to kind of read the room. And I don't want to overuse that phrase, but it's an important phrase. Make an effort to interpret what the dynamic is, where you're standing, right?
Yeah, to illustrate one of the things that Jim said in there, like, in some cultures, eye contact is a sign of respect. Like, look me in the eye and tell me what you mean. Say what you mean what you say. And in some, it's a threatening thing, right? Like, don't look me in the eyes unless you want to fight me. And people, like, that's one of those, like, you have to read the room. And I agree with Jim. Like, we don't want to overuse that. We've talked about that recently, but it's different from place to place.
That's the game. Yeah.
And speaking of that, there are also very important and distinct generational differences. And just geographically, some of it's not just geography, but you could see some trends geographically when it comes to the difference between the role of men and women. I told you I wasn't going to get too much into, like, masculinity stuff, but, like, in some cultures, matriarchy is a big deal and patriarchy is a big deal. And you need to kind of, like, understand a little bit about the role of the man or the role of the woman. And I'm not saying that you should, like, feed into that for yourself necessarily. I think you should just be kind of balanced and equal and fundamentally dynamic in that sense. But the person that you might be interacting with in a professional or social situation might not see it the same way. And that can lead to some ego situations, right? And Jim touched on this in the very beginning, but we talk about ego. We're talking kind of that's a kind of a vague term, right?
You know it when you see it. Right?
Yeah. Having a big ego or a big temper or being self-centered, right? There's also a whole bunch of, like, narcissism and personality stuff, and it's important that we differentiate a little bit between an ego, and having a big ego is one thing, but our own sense of self-worth and importance is also worthwhile and relevant. and not necessarily bad. There's a connotation that comes with ego when we say that just by itself. And we have to kind of like separate and tease all that out a little bit and just say, all right, what are we actually getting at when we say all those things?
Yeah, a lot of layers here, right? And we could take this a lot of different directions. I think you need to have a little bit of arrogance. I think you need to have a little bit of ego. You need to take your job seriously and take pride in it, right? Like you have to dig deep and find your pride to get through tough training, right? Hell week at SEAL training. I'll be damned if I'm going to go ring that bell, right? And so of course SEALs will have some ego. They have to, right? So you need that. It's what gets you through the rough days. And you can take pride in how good you are at a thing. You should take pride in how good you are at a thing, but you got to earn that pride. You don't get to call yourself good unless you're actually good. And that doesn't mean you can't take criticism on it, right? Mike has a big saying that I love. It's like, if you think you're better than everyone else, fucking act like it. If you really think you're better, be better.
Then fucking act like it.
Yeah. And my thing on this is like, take your job seriously, but like, you don't have to take yourself seriously. You can be a competent person and still acknowledge your faults and flaws and embrace them. That's a good thing, right?
And you can acknowledge that like you might be quite the warrior, but your match is out there. And so, like, no one cares. Work harder.
Yeah, have the humility to know you have to keep working to push yourself through the Dunning-Kruger curve and stuff. Another thing I want to hit while we're here is credit. This is part of like your self-worth and stuff. You have to have pride in your work, right? And when you do accomplish something, it's okay to take credit for it. You don't want to take credit for other people's work. And there's a great saying in the military, like there's no limit to the good you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Like that's a real thing. And I really do believe in that. But your paperwork is what gets promoted. And let me tell you how I know.
Yeah.
So it's fine to be humble, but when it's time to write your paperwork, learn from the Ghost of Christmas Future. Get your paperwork good. It's okay to brag in your performance reports, right?
Yeah. And that makes it all kind of tricky, right? Speaking of, one thing as it relates to understanding egos, we also need to understand why our industries in particular tend to amplify them, right? Military, public safety, the gun world, and et al., right? Like, there's a lot that goes into why the people that are into the things that might lead them to listen to this podcast amplify some of this ego stuff.
They might have an ego vulnerability. It is possible that some of our listeners have that. It's possible. Yeah. Some of our commenters might have that on Facebook.
Some of that is that the jobs and the things that we're into, just as interests or otherwise, right, just passionate about in general, require a level of confidence and decisiveness, right? Like those, and for people who work in this world, those are job requirements.
And controlled aggression and controlled dominance, right? Yeah. Mike's got to be able to walk into a scene where there are 5 big angry dudes fighting, and he has to be able to assert his lawful authority in that. And you can bet they're gonna be like, "Oh, you just got that badge, you got that ego, you're just trying to, whatever." I don't know what words they say to you, but they say words, I'm sure.
Lots of them.
And he's got to be able to navigate that and not get freaked out by it, right?
Well, and some of that comes from like a place of it's a lawfulness thing, but it's also like an ethics thing and like morality, right? Like where we're saying like, no, I'm doing the right thing here.
And that doesn't mean he's on a moral crusade, right? We ain't judging you, but you're still going to jail.
Sure. Right? But in that sense of morality, it's like I'm doing the right thing because it's right.
Yep.
Not because I'm certain that I'm going to win or that I'm certain that I'm like that I'm beyond mistakes or any of that, right? But like I'm coming from a place of trying to do the right thing. And along with that confidence and decisiveness as like a job requirement, performance requirement, also come the specialized knowledge and skills and at least a minimum level of expertise required to execute those things. I need to have like some legitimate understanding of what is right or wrong, at least in the eyes of the law, right? Legally, can I do this thing? Can I enter this house? Can I arrest this person? I have to have some level of expertise that informs those things.
And consider, we've done several episodes about this, like confidence versus competence is a journey. Learning is a journey, right? We shorthand that on the internet to the Dunning-Kruger effect or the Dunning-Kruger curve, right? Where you learn a little bit and you tend to get overconfident, and then you start learning how much you don't know and you get super humble, and then you get a little more confident, learn a little more, and then wham, something comes along and puts you back in your place. That is part of the learning journey. It's normal, it's natural, it's fine. It's fine to get overconfident, but the more open you are to coaching and the more self-aware you are,
it's also fine to learn from your mistakes.
Man's got to know his limits. Yeah. And one thing we don't talk enough about is the value of frustration in learning. I learned this in dog training. If a dog is frustrated, and training in general is frustrating. It's frustrating for everyone. If a dog is frustrated, that's often where the most crucial learning happens for the dog. He wants a treat, or the ball, or the wrapped up towel, or whatever, right? And he can't figure out how to please you to get it, and he starts trying to solve the puzzle. And that is when you get inspired and motivated learning. Often, puffed up confidence helps create that frustration in students. I even see it with my kids. My son talks a lot of smack until I beat him at Mario Kart. And then he gets mad and frustrated, and he wants a rematch. Right? He's trying to solve the puzzle. How do I beat Dad? The most serious I have ever seen my son take anything in his life was him watching a YouTube tutorial about how to win at Mario Kart.
Get some.
Because he wants to win, right? And that's a sense of ego. It's like, no, I'm not going to lose to my dad. He doesn't know how to play video games.
He ain't a gamer.
Son, don't quote the old magic to me. I was there when it was written, right? Got to keep him in check, right?
I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think frustration is actually a super big thing. And obviously it breaks plateaus, right? Is a big part of it. But it's also part of that like hierarchy of needs. If you don't feel super secure, you want to get to that next level, right? And so all of that is sort of a job requirement. But if you think about our lines of work where we need that level of expertise, we need that level of specialized skill, specialized knowledge. We need to know how to beat Dad at Mario Kart because Dad's going to come play in Mario Kart, right? Like,
yeah, and you need to know how to beat someone at a police chase because you have to win the police chase, right? Like you don't let the bad guys get away.
Yeah,
it's like Mario Kart, but with real cars.
Yeah, yeah, but related to all of that is just self-reliance, and that's a real survival skill. One of the big ethos of like military, law enforcement, survival type people is like no one is coming. It's up to us. It's up to me, right? That self-reliance is a value that we have that drives a lot of that ego. And it's funny in the context of like SHOT Show, right? Where you interact with so many of like-minded people. It's like we have that in common. We're not enemies in that sense. And sometimes I would have conversations with people and it's like, hey dude, I'm not like, I'm with you. Like we're not like enemies here, right? Like we're working together here. We're on the same team. But you see that a lot in our industries, right? And I'm not throwing shade at SHOT Show. You see that everywhere, right? So that brings us into some of the cultural stuff. And I mentioned this earlier, and I talked about how we're going to get into it as it relates to our culture in particular, right? Military, law enforcement, just the people who are risk comfortable or risk taking types of career fields where the stakes are high, right? The risk is high, and we have a lot of that self-sufficiency on the table. And one of the things that has occurred to me as it relates to our culture or our cultures collectively is that we have this view that our jobs are those of consequence. Now, that's true. And I felt the same way when I worked on an ambulance and as a lifeguard, that like I'm out here trying to help people who might actually need my help to live and survive. Fair, right? But I think that mentality is problematic because it can lead to a heightened sense of self-importance. And this is something that I think our audience in particular, especially, should be careful and aware of, because like I mentioned earlier, we are the main characters in our stories. And for a lot of service-oriented professions like public safety and the military, our sense of duty is a big part of our ethos. And it's really easy to see the things that we deal with front and center all the time in our day-to-day as like the most dangerous or the most important or whatever. And that sounds a lot more like a comparison, an us versus them mentality, and a lot less like about serving people or the citizens or the country. It sounds a lot more like we are in this for the glory and for validation or recognition from others than about our sense of purpose or calling. The truth of the matter is that you are probably a lot safer working in law enforcement, just as one example, my example, right, than, say, being a logger or working in mining or construction or being a gosh darn delivery driver. Go check out the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics and see. Look at the most dangerous jobs, and you might be surprised at what you find.
Yeah, so that hurt to listen to for me personally and my ego. I often feel like I feel the weight of my job, right? I have a consequential job. I like to say often my job would be easy if there weren't any consequences, right? But I take it seriously. And I think that's one of the reasons I was hired into the job that I'm in, is because I do take it seriously. But it's easy to take that too far, right? We, America, need that set at a certain level. And if you convince yourself like, well, I can't take a day off because the building will burn down if I take a day off. Well, if you really believe that, you have fucked up. You need to have the rest of your building able to run without you, because guess what? You are highly dispensable. No matter what your job is, no matter how critical, how mission essential you are dispensable.
Like the President of the United States.
There's a replacement plan for him.
Like in black and white, right? Like it is very, very clear.
Yep.
You are replaceable.
Your replacement has already been chosen.
Yeah,
and
literally.
that's a healthy thing. Like that's part of your humility, is recognizing I am dispensable and I am here to serve as long as I'm here to serve, right? When we think about the high performing teams, and Mike and I have also talked about how you stock a high performing team, how you select for it, right? The highest performing teams I know often bring in teams of psychologists to help build their profile for what they're looking for. And they will interview candidates, and they're looking for certain traits at certain levels. I reached out to a buddy who does that for a living, an organizational psychologist for a national enterprise. And he told me that he doesn't look at ego specifically in the workplace, but he has looked at dozens of other personality dimensions and factors, and, the Myers-Briggs tests and ESTJs or whatever, Leo, Capricorn, Sagittarius. And each personality dimension is nuanced. I added that, not him, just so you know. Each personality dimension is nuanced, and the degree it is healthy or not is specific to the job and associated knowledge, skills, and abilities required to do the job. Now, you've heard about us talk about that on this podcast. Like, we need some of those attributes at like a 7 out of 10, but we don't want them at a 12 out of 10, right? And it could even be affected by what equipment or machines or tech that you're working with. There's a term for that. It's the EMTTs, equipment, machines, tools, and technologies, right? A certain type of personality needs to be hands-on with a shovel, and a certain type of personality needs to be hands-on with an F-35. And there are very intelligent people who work shovels, but it's a certain type of intelligence, it's a certain type of personality that can drive a highly advanced, tech-enabled stealth fighter, right? And my buddy continued. He said, the closest term he can come up with to this ego thing that Mike and I are talking about is entitlement.
Yeah.
Entitlement is a problem, and it's really bad in most jobs. And he's worked at a company that like sells a test, and Jim, am not endorsing this, and I don't think Mike is. But he suggested checking out a website called saferhire.com, saferhire.com, and just like check it out. Their screening that they do tends to, according to their data, reduce workers' comp costs and turnover. And the whole thing that they're looking for is entitlement. Or it's not the whole thing, but it's one of the big things, apparently. The other thing that stood out to him is ego also correlates to extroversion, right? Someone who is all out there. And while ego seems bad, and again, I don't think it necessarily does, the job will matter a lot, right? If I would bet he would bet his life that ego, in this case, maintaining confidence under duress, is critical as, say, a special operator.
I think this is an important distinction for the entire episode. When we talk about ego, it's easy to connotate, like, it's easy to have this like negative vibe.
Yeah.
What we have to recognize is like ego is just a thing. It's a thing that we all have, right? Our ego is just a thing. And going back to like Jim's 7 out of 10 thing, does it have to be over the top? You can have some ego, but not too much ego. You can be assertive and confident and all those things. So ego doesn't necessarily have to be bad. We just have to recognize that it requires some level of balance. And in the context of this discussion, when I talk about why I wanted to have this, our industries and our people, our audience, right, is that we are the type of people who are going to have an ego, quote unquote. It's about regulating that and managing that and checking that. Check your ego, right? Like just have it under control.
Yeah. And the word entitlement, I kind of keyed in on of like, you are not entitled to be on the SWAT team. And if you walk in acting like it, you're going to get your ego checked.
Let me know how it works.
Yeah. You're not entitled to be a U.S. Navy SEAL.
Right.
And if you walk into Bud's acting like that, you're going to get checked. Right.
Yeah.
You are entitled to try. You're entitled to work your ass off. And if you understand that and understand that distinction, things will work better for you. Same with like DEI. That's a big topic as we're recording this, diversity, inclusion, and whatever. Great. The people who do the best are entitled to try. They're entitled to go out for the team.
But most of them want to prove their own worth on their own accord, right? Like on their own like quality.
Yeah. And I'll leave that topic at that. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So this one time I was trying out for a very high stakes job. I got the job. It was cool. I was trying out interviewing for a very high stakes job in national security. And the interviewer, not a psychologist, just the lead interviewer, asked me point blank if I would consider myself arrogant. Which again, it's funny. I'm a pilot. And I said, well,
They already
yeah,
know the answer.
yeah, I, and they wanted to see how I'd react, right? I said, yes, I am. And I have to be, right? I need a certain level of arrogance to function and thrive as an imperfect person in a perfection-oriented and high-stakes job. As a pilot, I've got to be able to look myself in the mirror or look my crew in the face and tell them we're going to land that plane. No matter what's wrong with it, no matter how bad the weather is, no matter how short the runway is, we're going to land the plane. I'm going to get them through it, right? And I have to believe it, and they have to believe it. I don't want a timid brain surgeon. If I have like some tumor inside my head, I don't want the surgeon to be like, I don't know. 60% of the time I work every time. I don't want to hear that. Even if it's true, I don't want to hear that. I don't want them to give me that vibe. I don't want an uncertain CIA operations officer. That does not sound safe or worthwhile, right? Effective. I don't want the hostage rescue team who's coming to save me to be unsure whether they can make the brainstem shot. No, I want them to be able to make the brainstem shot, right? Every single time. And if they have to go like check their ego and go learn from the competition shooters how to do it, I want them to do that, right? But then I want them to believe they can do it.
And similarly, as the guy that might do the hostage rescue, I want to be confident and certain about if I'm going to pull that trigger, like, yeah, I got this. I want to be that guy.
Yeah, but it means you got to put in the work
and
to get to that point.
100%. Right? But my point is, it's not a matter of pride, right? I want the confidence to know that I will be willing to take that shot because I know I can make it. And what I don't want, because I think these are all fair points about those people and professions, right? But the balance in all of that to what Jim is describing there is I don't want an overzealous one of those, right? Brain surgeon or otherwise, CIA guy, hostage rescue guy, to be so sure and so certain of himself that he is blind to his limitations. And that's hard because to some degree, you don't really get one without the other, right? And this happens a lot. Like I see this with when we integrate, we do training with like SWAT and canine integration stuff. You'll have a team leader or a commander who might ask a dog handler, hey, can your dog do X or Y or Z? And there are dog handlers out there. They don't want to seem timid or uncertain, and so they'll be like, yeah, totally. And the reality is they don't know. They've never actually experienced or tested that. And also it's a dog. Like the dog has his own independent thought and action. So like I can't guarantee you anything, right? But it takes a little bit of courage and some self-awareness to say, no promises, but maybe. Like I could try. I've experienced this a couple of times, and I can tell you with some degree of certainty, yes or no. But especially when the stakes are high, we need to know where our blind spots are. I can't have the CIA operations guy who is just so sure of this thing in his gut that he says X or Y or Z, and he's going to sit with that because he's unwilling to admit where his blind spots are, or the hostage rescue guy, or the pilot, or whoever, right? You've got to have some balance in that.
So there's a common phrase that in the tactical world that self-awareness is a superpower. And I don't like to, again, try not to overstate, oh, X is a superpower, Y is a superpower. You only get so many superpowers. But your ability to accurately assess your strengths and your weaknesses and your capabilities and your limitations is a big part of having a healthy ego and not an unhealthy ego.
Yeah. So, all this being said, a big part of this episode is hopefully going to inspire our audience to check their own ego.
You would say check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Yeah. That. But I also acknowledge and respect that a lot of the people listening to this show are pretty self-aware with a high degree of humility, and that's why you're listening, hopefully, because this show is very much oriented towards professional development and the sorts of people that want to improve. And although we might make fun of our industries here and there, I do want our audience to know that like we respect and acknowledge your presence here and that you listen. So with that, I also want to talk about just some ideas to help navigate or deal with or disarm the egos that you might have to interact with, both professionally and personally, but also in the sense of conflict, right? Because there are times where, I mentioned this kind of just briefly, but like the Walmart parking lot, some guy wants to talk big and he's got a big ego and he wants to fight or whatever, and you need to kind of de-escalate that. And I do think there is a place here for tactical application when it comes to dealing with arrogance and egos. Number one, I think, start with just be kind. I do think that a lot of people who live in this kind of like self-defense, EDC, Second Amendment, stand your ground kind of mentality, they refuse to be a victim. And that's okay. I respect that, right? Like, I'll be damned if anyone's going to rob me or mug me at an ATM or whatever. But if you find yourself at the brink of some sort of conflict, start with just be kind. And recognize when you start butting heads with somebody that there are some deeper rooted stuff, right? Deeper rooted places that this could come from. Generationally, culturally, psychologically, like in a biology sense, family history, whatever, right?
Courtesy costs you nothing.
Yeah.
Respect costs you nothing. And being a responsible, mature, kind adult costs you nothing.
Yeah. And like consider like asking like, hey man, is everything okay? Like, do you need someone to talk to? Like just something like that might go a long way. Just be kind and understand that like, although someone might be a dick and might have an ego or a temper, like that could be because they're coming from a place of deeper rooted issues. Just food for thought, right? Remember that you have your moments too. And maturity and wisdom is one thing. I've certainly learned a lot over the years, but even then I have my moments where I might be out on a call and I'm like, all right, motherfucker, like, I don't feel like you're bullshit right now. And we all have our moments. And so consider that if you find yourself on the receiving end of this. That leads me to just be calm. Calm is a superpower. And calm is contagious, right? If you meet fire with fire, or if you add fuel to it, it's just a recipe for disaster. Calm is a superpower and calm is contagious. If you can just detach a little bit and see the situation for what it is and not having something to do specifically with you, that goes a long way.
And one of the reasons that matters is that gives your brain a chance to pop out of the subconscious, I'm following my drives thing, to think about the situation from kind of like overhead view and be like, ooh, maybe I'm part of the problem. Maybe I'm the bad guy here.
Yeah.
Right?
Or fueling into it, right?
Yeah.
One of the tools I learned for this back in the day about leadership stuff was to address the action, not the person. And Jim talked about this in a recent episode. He said there's a big difference between like stay the fuck back and stay back, motherfucker.
Yep.
Right? There's a difference between addressing the action and the person. And where I think that takes us is like address like the issue itself. Like get past the issue. Get past the ego to address the issues. Figure out what the issue actually is. Like, what is actually the problem here, right? Is it that hey, my bad, I cut you off in traffic, like not the end of the world. That's my mistake. Apologize for that, dude. Hey, can I buy you a beer? Here's $20, right? Like, I mean, and I'm not saying you got to go pay $20 to everybody. I'm just like, for example, right? If it avoids like a bigger issue when you're out with your like family, your kids, something like that, do we need to go into armed conflict over this? Is it worth have I spent $20 on dumber things? Probably, right? So just consider, get past the ego and work on the issues, right? I find a lot of times we deal with ego stuff in a professional or business sense, sometimes socially, but like often it's like a negotiation or we're trying to court somebody in a professional or business way for whatever reason. And one of the things I feel like you could do to get past that is just ask better questions. And a lot of times what a guy gets really fired up about when his ego is flared up and he's like, he wants to really make himself look big, is he's trying to just assert their dominance in a way. And if you just ask better questions, it might fall apart. If you get through the crust of the ego, the rest of it falls apart, right? And that requires some active listening. And one of the skills about active listening, and there's a lot of skills related to that, right, is you can't just jump straight to problem solving and try to like break down everything right then and there. You have to show a little bit of empathy and establish some trust and rapport. And then with time and active listening, you build enough trust and rapport to gain influence and to establish some behavior change. So asking better questions, open-ended questions, can go a long way, I think. And my last thing on this is just
one thing real quick. Listening. Stop and listen. Like, that's part of the be calm and detach and be kind. Like, what is that person telling you? And try to read it a little bit. You don't need to read into it. You don't need to psychoanalyze them. You often don't have time in a tactical situation, but like, listen to the person talking to you and give them your attention.
Yeah.
Like active listening back in the day used to mean like ask good questions, open-ended questions. Nowadays in 2025, 2026, it's like sit down your phone, sit down your radio and make eye contact. Like we have a generation of people who do not socially engage well, who are a little bit, what's the word? Slow on social engagement. And some of that is nature, some of that's nurture, some of that a person can't help. But man, it is a generational thing. And I'm not even knocking like the Gen Z guys. I think millennials maybe have it the worst. Some of my elders have it even worse than that because they don't have any like cultural reference for like to set down their phones sometimes. You need to really listen.
Yeah. So my last thing on this is just to be pragmatic, right? Like this is all about problem solving. Don't take everything personal. Don't feed into an ego or your own ego unless it's a tactical choice. And there's a time and a place. Like, don't get me wrong. There are certainly situations I've been in as a police officer where I've taken a stance with somebody and been like, sit down or I'm going to put you down. Right? Like, I am willing to bring lawful authority to force people into compliance if I have to. I'm not telling you should be weak. But be pragmatic about that. Be humble about that. Right? Like, it's not about us versus them. It's a tactical choice. So you have to detach and be able to say that, like, hey, this is the right choice in this situation. And sometimes it's not, right? If you have the option to avoid or prevent a conflict, then do it. And for a lot of situations or circumstances, and I'm not saying law enforcement, but just generally, maybe walking or even running away is the best choice. Consider those situations that you have nothing to prove. Your worth and validation don't come from other people. So if you can avoid the problem, then just do it. And I mean that both in a tactical, self-defense, survival, getting in a fight kind of way, and also like a business negotiation, professional, I'm trying to be effective with my bosses. Hey, some battles are just not worth having. And that's one of the things about this episode that I think is really important is I'm not trying to make this too much about fighting and self-defense or too much about professional, like navigating the bosses kind of thing. I think it applies fundamentally at a human, personal, individual level about being humble and checking your own ego. There are certain fights that are just not worth having, and you don't have to get worked up about it. You don't have to not have the fight and then still be pissed off in the background. Like, you could just let things go and find your own self-worth and your own value and validation from somewhere else within. And I think that's important to recognize. That being said, sometimes violence might be the only answer. It might be the solution. And I mean that both in a professional and a survival sense. Like, sometimes you might have to literally fight or shoot or whatever. And sometimes you might need to, there might be battles worth having with the bosses in a professional way or whatever. But before you jump to that, make sure that you've checked your ego and you've accounted for all the ways that you might have things wrong. Sometimes you can avoid it. Sometimes you just need better boundaries. And one of the things about boundaries is it's not about other people, right? It's not about like telling, hey, Jim, if you do this or else. That's one kind of boundary. But a better kind of boundary is, if Jim does X, then I'm going to do Y. The boundary is something I hold for myself. And I think that's an important distinction, right? And sometimes it's just a matter about communicating better, communicating your needs better, communicating what those boundaries are better. And remember that we thrive often by comparison. But this isn't about what they are saying or what they are doing. It's about us and what we are doing. It's about our own self. So check yourself, as Jim said, before you wreck yourself.
That's poetic. I like it.
It's really going for that. I really put that together. No, that's not true. I kind of made it up on the fly, but it's good.
Yeah. So I want you to be self-aware, and I don't want you to just say the words self-aware. I need you to understand that you need to have an accurate sense of your strengths, your weaknesses, your capabilities, your limitations. I want you aware of the fact that you never stop being a student, right? You are on a journey of learning.
I love that. Yeah.
And the second you forget that, you're going to be the prick that nobody wants to work with, right? I want you to be socially aware about how you are coming across. How does the other person and how does their ego interpret the cues you are giving off? And that was really hard for me growing up. This is one of the things, I had a lot of coaching because I'm not a real social cat. I had a couple of mentors who were like, hey, Jim, you think you're coming across like this, but you're really coming across like this. Do you understand that? And I'd be like, no. Oops. And that made a big difference, right? So consider that like if you're a FTO, field training officer, with your new recruit out on the beat, they may think they're coming across a certain way, and it might be your job as a mentor to help them realize, hey, let's watch the game tape on that and see how you really came across. Ooh, okay. In that self-awareness journey, I want you to ask yourself a few questions. For example, if you're in a tense situation with somebody, I want you to ask yourself, is this other person doing whatever their behavior is out of ego? Are they doing it out of a genuine belief, or are they putting on an act? Because those are kind of different things. I want you to ask yourself, can I leverage this person's ego vulnerability to my advantage? by either puffing them up or maybe piercing them a little bit. But if I'm going to do that, I'm going to do it on purpose, right? Fight relaxed, be deliberate about it. This other person with their ego issue, do they act like this one-on-one or only when they're in groups? That might help you kind of read the situation. Is it amplified when they engage with me, or is they just generally, do they act like this, right? Am I doing something that's triggering their kind of like ego self-importance response? And to this person, if they have an ego issue, is that a real barrier to them learning, to team cohesion and mission success? And the question I'm going with that is like, do I have to fix it, or can I just deal with it? And as a mentor or a coach or a team leader, those are things you're going to have to assess, right? How do we fix this person if that is the issue? Because you will come across people who have that as an issue. And embarrassing them sounds like a good idea. That's kind of our natural inclination. And that might work, or it might make it worse.
Well, or just might make it, if not worse, just generally
hostile.
Yeah, like difficult. Whereas like you could just accept it and move on. Like I said, detach, right? Yeah. Like be practical about it. Like understand where it comes from. Be kind. Hey, this person's probably a little insecure. If they're overcompensating a little bit, it's not the end of the world. Like that's okay. I was like that when I was younger and less mature too. And I grew from that, and they will too. They'll have their moment. That's okay. Let it go. Don't get worked up over it. So that's all I got on this. I think just check your ego, man. It's going to be great.
All right, be safe out there. Be smart out there. Be humble out there. And have a good one.
All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you. This episode is also brought to you by 09 Holsters. We talk a lot about people, ideas, and hardware on this show, so when we invest in equipment, we always think in terms of experience first. 09 is helping you figure out how to carry the gear you need to be effective. They are built by cops, for cops, with a minimalist design and bomb-proof durability. Radio cases, flashlights, body cameras, even canine remotes, you name it, 09 has been filling a void in tactical duty holsters for more than a decade. Go see what they offer at 09 Holsters, that's ZERO, the number 9, holsters.com. 09, built to win the fight. Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.